Free will is a funny thing. No matter how hard you try, you can never prove that it exists, just as you cannot prove that it doesn't, which is exactly why it has sparked so many philosophical discussions and birthed different stances, such as absolute determinism. This position defends that there are an infinite number of unknown factors that effectively determine your every choice and action. As such, even a choice as simple as what to have for breakfast is not really a choice, but rather an inevitable outcome. The illusion of choice is merely your brain trying to come up with an excuse to justify your behavior. On the opposite end of the spectrum from absolute determinism is free will itself. It's defined as the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, or the ability to act at one's own discretion. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you chose to have cereal this morning or were forced to by the uncaring universe. But I will argue that, within the confines of Teyvat, there is no such thing as free will. Not for any of the characters in it, and not for you either. And I have evidence that suggests just that. Exhibit A: Unreconciled Stars. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Unreconciled Stars was an event that took place during version 1.1. During the event, there was a meteor shower. Later, everyone who came into contact with these meteors fell into deep sleep, during which they dreamt of trying to climb a giant mountain. Mona was able to discover that these meteors were actually Stella Fortuna, meaning the stars that make up a person's constellation, the same ones that Mona uses to scry the future of the people she encounters. In other words, the stars hold a person's fate being, by definition, incompatible with free will. But that's not even the most interesting part. Early in the event, we discovered that Fischl's vision flashes when it is around these meteors. If you pay attention, all visions flash when your character's burst is ready, because flashing indicates a high concentration of elemental energy. But why would this Stella Fortuna have so much elemental energy? These particular ones belonged to Leonard, an adventurer who had lived 2000 years prior. There is no indication that he had a vision. In fact, he lived prior to the end of the Archon War, meaning the Seven weren't yet in power, and I'm not even sure visions were a thing before the Seven Thrones were established. We know that Kanyu, being only alpha-illuminated beast, needs a vision to wield elemental power, and hers was only bestowed after the Archon War, though that's anecdotal evidence at best. Still, we have no reason to assume that Leonard's constellation was an exception, so likely all constellations have a lot of elemental energy contained within them, which may be explained by Scaramouche's iconic line.
The stars, the sky, it's all a gigantic hoax, a lie.
Ominous, isn't it? While I still can't figure out exactly what it means, it does sound like it's telling us that the sky and the stars contained within it are fake, which is supported by Mona telling us she was taught to speak of the fake sky when doing readings. And if the sky is fake, that means it's artificial. And if it is artificial, then it needs to have been made by someone or something. And who is capable of doing such a thing? As far as we know, only the gods have that sort of power. Perhaps the Adepti too, as they have the power of subcreation, but how likely is that when they too have constellations of their own? Who else has constellations of their own? The Archons. So not them either. Which leaves Celestia. They are also the ones who hand out visions, so them reacting to the meteors is just like reacting to like. Most bizarre of all is that the Traveler also has a constellation, despite not being from this world. Sometimes, in the loading screen, you get lucky enough to be treated to this delightful quote about constellations. Wherever you go, whatever life throws at you, in Teyvat, the stars in the sky will always have a place for you. No thank you. That's not comforting at all. In fact, it kinda sounds like a threat. It almost sounds like it's telling the Traveler that once they step foot into Teyvat, they can no longer live, which so far has been true. This idea of fate also ties into the gacha system. The currency we use to pull is called intertwined fates, or acquaint fates for the standard banner, which makes it sound like whatever character you pulled was fated to have their path intertwined with the Travelers. According to the voice lines, the idea is that whatever character you pull actually physically joins you in your journey, even if that doesn't happen in the story. And this currency not only happens to let you pull the first copy of a character, but also their Stella Fortuna, which is visually represented as a falling meteor. Meaning none of your favorite characters got to join you of their own free will, they were forced to by their own fate. So it sounds like Celestia may have a way to determine people's fates and seal them in the stars. Counter-argument? If that is true, then why don't they just make everyone comply? Why allow humans and archons alike to rebel? I'm not sure. I don't have enough information to go off of. But for the time being, just remember that Celestia may be responsible for writing people's fate. I promise I'll come back to this in a bit. For the time being, let us move on to Exhibit B, The Traveler and the Illusion of Choice. The Traveler is known as a silent protagonist because they are rarely ever voiced, but that doesn't mean they don't talk. Though they let Paimon do most of the exposition and dialogue, every now and again a couple of dialogue bubbles pop up to let you choose what you, as the player, want the Traveler to say. You get to choose, right? Well, not really. Sometimes both options are legitimately different. For instance, at the very start of the game, when we first meet Kaya, we can choose to act all noble after facing Dvalin, or choose to pull a Paimon and ask for a reward. Those two options denote a very different personality for the Traveler, one you get to choose. In these cases, you may even get a slightly different reply depending on which one you go with. But that's where it ends. You gotta come back, and then the story just unfolds in the exact same way, no matter what you chose. It's like the consequences of your choices never ripple into the future. At the end of the day, they are totally and utterly inconsequential. And in some cases, like with commissions, you can choose to say no, but the NPCs will just talk over your protest and you have to do it anyway. But it gets worse. Because more often than not, your options aren't options at all. Usually text is simply divided into two different speech bubbles, but one is a continuation of the other. The responses you get make it very clear that the Traveler said both of them, regardless of which one you clicked on. So why even give you a choice at all? Why not just display the Traveler's speech within the dialogue box, just like everyone else's? Is it just to spite dialogue skippers? Or is it meant to give you the illusion of choice? Maybe it's just meant to make you feel like the captain of the ship, when in reality you are just getting swept along for the ride. But if it makes you feel any better, the Traveler is very much on the same boat. They start their journey and immediately get roped into saving nation after nation without getting anything for it. By the time we get to Inazuma, the Traveler has had enough. They slam their foot down and say no. And what did that do for them? Absolutely nothing. They still had to save yet another nation, and in the end learned nothing about their sibling. Even before getting to Sumeru, it was like the Traveler was already within their very own samsara. They may not have been moving in circles, but they are definitely moving in a spiral. They are but slaves to their own journey. And this may just be me being paranoid, but I get the feeling that the further along the story we are, the less actual dialogue options we are given. It's as though the game is slowly but surely dispelling the illusion of free will for both us and the Traveler. If that is the case, then eventually we will probably be shown the true nature of our shackles. But the Traveler isn't the only one contending with a lack of freedom. I present to you Exhibit C, Barbatus, the god of freedom itself. How ironic. Venti is something of an absentee archon, but that's not due to his laziness, though that certainly helps too. He chooses to sleep for centuries at a time and only awakens when his people need his help. Being the god of freedom, he believes that actively ruling over his people would restrict their freedom. As he famously put it, what is freedom when demanded of you by a god? Except he never actually said that. I think that's the quote people usually remember, but what he actually said to Dvalin was, freedom, if demanded of you by an archon, is really not freedom at all. The first quote actually comes from Dainsleif, more specifically from the Teyvat chapter storyline teaser, and it's quite interesting because he gives us a brief description of each nation, and for each one he gives us one line that foreshadows the problems each archon and their nation face. For instance, for Liyue he said,
"The god of contracts, senselessly slaughtered as his people watched on in horror. In the end, he will sign the contract to end all contracts."
Which is referring to Morax accepting the inevitability of erosion and realizing that his people no longer need him to thrive, thus deciding to step down by forging one last contract with the Tsaritsa. For Inazuma, we got,
In the secluded land of the immortal Shogun, the Bakufu rules eternal. But what do mortals see of the eternity chased after by their god?
Which is hinting at Beelzebub's refusal to accept the cyclical nature of eternity and shutting down Inazuma, which resulted in a civil war. As for Sumeru, we got this.
The god of wisdom's enemy is wisdom itself, and the oasis of knowledge is a mirage in the desert of ignorance. In the city of scholars, there is a push for folly, yet the god of wisdom makes no argument against it.
Which is probably referring to the academia not allowing Kusanali to reign and ruling Sumeru themselves, or it might also have to do with the Scarlet King. There is no point in discussing Fontaine, Natlan, or Snezhnaya, as we don't know yet what those Archon quests will entail. That said, up to now these little hints have been quite spot on in pointing out the kinds of problems that await us. Except for Mondstadt's, because Venti never demanded freedom from anyone, not to mention that his nation's problems didn't even truly revolve around him like what happened with the other Archons. He just showed up when he was needed. If anything, he gave Dvalin his freedom back without expecting anything in return. Also, in his quote he mentions Archons only, because he's referring to himself. But Tainslave uses the broader term God, which does encapsulate the Archons, but also refers to the gods of Celestia. It makes me think that he wasn't actually referring to the Dvalin situation, but rather he may have been foreshadowing something much bigger. And yes, this is where Celestia enters the picture once more. And to explain why, we need to turn our attention to the prologue of the Genshin manga. It tells us the story of how Venti awoke from his slumber to free his people from the tyrannic grasp of the aristocracy, and how he and Vanessa met. Vanessa was a slave of the Lawrence clan, often made to fight in the arena for their entertainment. But after crossing the sun of the clan, she was ordered to fight one last battle and promised that both her and her people would be able to go free if she won. What she did not know was that her opponent would be Ursa the Drake. The night before her last fight, Vanessa is being kept in a jail when Venti, knowing better than to trust the Lawrences, appears to her and offers to free her. But Vanessa claims that freedom given freely is only a guise for another shackle, and chooses to stay and fight. But having grown up hearing about how the greatest heroes are chosen by Celestia to be immortal and protect the world alongside the gods, Vanessa asks Venti to tell her a story about Celestia, so that it might give her courage. But Venti has this flashback of menacing hooded figures the moment he hears the word Celestia, and gets visibly disquieted and awkward. I can't get over the symbolism here. We have a slave, chained and jailed, who rejects the notion of easy freedom given by the divine. In the same jail, we have the god of freedom himself, trembling at the mere mention of the abode of the gods. Venti didn't force his freedom on her, but his own lack thereof may be being forced on him by Celestia. If you have to uphold freedom, can you yourself be free? Want more foreshadowing and symbolism? Roll in Exhibit D, the defiled statue of the Seven. You know, the statue the Beast Order corrupted. The one that killed a guy, no biggie. Yeah, I hope you remember that, because Tainslave and the Traveler definitely don't. Why is it Barbatus' statue specifically? Each statue resonates with a different element, at least for the Traveler and likely for their sibling. But other than that, the only difference seems to be their design. They all work in the same way. So why did it have to be a statue of the Animal Archon? I want to point out that the domain where the statue was hidden was in Liyue. So it's not like the Abyss Order just picked up the nearest statue. I assume it was originally somewhere within Mondstadt, so they went through the trouble of moving it to Liyue, which makes me feel like they really wanted a specific statue. And what did they do with it? They corrupted it, but they also inverted it. The funny thing about symbols is that they often represent the opposite of the original meaning when inverted. So from freedom to determinism, fate and oppression, just like Canria was oppressed by Celestia, just like Celestia continues to oppress and control us all. What about you? Do you think free will and freedom exist within the world of Teyvat? Or are we all just pawns in their great game of chess? Do tell me what you think in the comments down below. I'll be sure to read them all. So, without further ado, my name is Blue and I'll see you again very soon. Safe journey, travelers.